There is a kind of patience that nobody teaches you and nobody praises you for. It isn't dramatic, it doesn't announce itself. It shows up on Saturday mornings in an old pickup truck idling outside an art studio, waiting on a girl who never once asked you to come. I did that for 17 years. And 3 days before my stepdaughter's wedding, she stood in my garage doorway and told me she'd rather I didn't come to that either. My name is Gil Reeves. I'm 62 years old. I spent 31 years as an HVAC contractor out of Knoxville, Tennessee, which means I know how to fix the thing that makes a house bearable to live in, and I know how to do it without making a fuss. I drive a '09 F-150 with a cracked dashboard I keep meaning to replace. I own 2 dress shirts. One of them has a small burn mark near the collar from an incident involving a soldering iron that I'd rather not get into. I am not a man who talks easily about what he feels. But I need to tell you this story because I think somebody out there needs to hear that showing up, quietly, without recognition, year after year, is not the same as being invisible. Stay with me, because what I left on that kitchen counter 3 days before the wedding changed everything. Hit that like button while I'm getting started here, and if you're not subscribed yet, do that now. You'll want to be here for what comes next. I met Faye in the summer of 2005 at a 4th of July cookout hosted by my neighbor Darlene, who had strong opinions about community togetherness and an equally strong hand with potato salad. Faye brought the other potato salad. We disagreed mildly about mayonnaise ratios, and I decided she was interesting enough to find out about. She told me about Cassidy on our 3rd date. We were at a diner on Kingston Pike, and she set her sweet tea down very carefully, like she was putting down something loaded. I have a daughter, she said. She's 7. Her name is Cassidy. Her father, her biological father, his name is Lance. Lance and I have been done for 2 years, but Lance is still, he comes around when he can. She looked at me with the kind of eyes that have practiced not flinching. I need to know you understand what that means before this goes any further. It means you have a daughter, I said. I heard you the first time. She was quiet for a moment. Most men hear that and they find a reason to leave. I was still sitting there. I kept sitting there for 17 years. Cassidy was 7 years old. When I first met her, small, serious, with her mother's dark eyes and what I would later understand was her own particular brand of dignity. She shook my hand when Faye introduced us. Actually shook it, firm, like a little businesswoman, looked me directly in the eye, and then went back to her room without another word. Smart kid, I thought. She's already learned that men who come through this door don't always stay. I decided that day I was going to be the exception, not because I had something to prove, but because I'd spent 45 years on this earth learning that the things worth doing are mostly the things nobody gives you credit for. Faye and I got married in the summer of 2007 on a Saturday in June when the humidity had not yet turned the whole Smoky Mountain region into a sauna. Cassidy wore a yellow dress and spent most of the reception talking to Faye's cousin's dog. She did not smile for a single photograph with me, and I found that completely reasonable. She was 9 years old and she'd been asked to accept a stranger as a permanent fixture in her home. The least she deserved was to feel however she actually felt about it. The first year was what I'd call a professional distance. I did not come in with enthusiasm or gifts. I did not try to be the fun dad or the cool stepdad or anything that required an audition. I lived in the house, paid my share, fixed what broke, and let her watch me. When Cassidy was 9, she started art classes on Saturday mornings. Faye worked weekends at the dental office then, so I drove her. Every Saturday at 8:45, I'd back the truck out of the driveway and she'd climb in, settle her supply bag between her feet, and look out the window the whole way there. 40 minutes of silence every week for 3 years. I'm an HVAC man. I've spent my career working in silence in crawl spaces and attics. I am comfortable with silence. One November morning, she must have been 12. She climbed into the truck and said, out of nowhere, "You never come inside to see what we're working on." I'd waited in the parking lot every week. I didn't want to hover. "You can if you want," she said. "I don't care." That is the most generous thing she had ever said to me up to that point. I treated it like the gift it was. Out loud, I said, "Yeah, all right." She nodded. That was it. But I want you to know that the following Saturday I walked into that studio in the back of a converted building on Market Street and stood against the wall in my work jacket and watched that girl paint a watercolor of a mountain ridge with the kind of quiet concentration that made something shift in my chest that I didn't have a name for, not yet. Now I need to tell you about Faye, not the Faye you've met so far, the Faye underneath that one. Before she met me, Faye had been left. Lance walked out when Cassidy was 5. Packed his things on a Friday, had a new address in Charlotte, North Carolina by Monday. Before Lance, there was a man named Wesley who lasted 14 months before deciding that the life he described wanting was not, in fact, the life he wanted. Faye had been through two men who looked permanent and turned out to be temporary. She had built something around herself and around Cassidy in response. Not a wall exactly, more like a habit of not quite believing in permanence. She wanted me to stay, I know she did, but she did not trust that I would, and she was not going to let her daughter fall for a man who might one day decide to go. So she started managing it, quietly, the way you manage something you're afraid of losing. When Cassidy was 10 and had just started to warm up to me the smallest bit, just enough that she'd sometimes come into the living room when I was watching the game instead of staying in her room, Faye would say things, small things. Conversational seeds dropped into soft ground. Gil works long days, baby. Big jobs, a lot of driving. Men with big jobs, their schedules change. You know how it is. When Cassidy was 12 and I hadn't missed a single Saturday art pickup in 3 years, Faye said, "Gil's a good man. I just don't want you to build your whole world around any one person, sweetheart. People change. Circumstances change. Just keep a little something in reserve." When Cassidy was 13, she almost called me Dad. It was an accident. She was talking fast, excited about something, and it almost came out, and then she caught it and went red in the face and left the room like she'd done something embarrassing. Faye took her aside that night. I don't know exactly what was said, but Cassidy never came close to that word again. Faye was not trying to hurt me. I want you to hold on to that, because this story is harder to carry if you make her a villain, and she wasn't one. She was a woman who had been left twice and could not survive watching her daughter attached to a man who might do the same thing. The devastating irony, the thing I've sat with on a lot of cold mornings, is that I was precisely the man who was never going to leave. I was the permanent one. And Faye spent 17 years teaching Cassidy to treat me like a temporary arrangement. Cassidy grew up thinking her distance from me was self-possession. She was keeping herself safe. She had no idea she was living inside her mother's fear. I kept driving to art class, kept signing permission slips, kept showing up. Now I need to tell you about Bo Dunbar. Bo and I went to Maryville High together about 1,000 years ago, played on the same baseball team, worked the same summer jobs at his uncle's hardware store on Broadway. I went into HVAC. Bo went into contracting, then real estate, then property management, and now owns a portfolio of rental properties in Knox County that makes me feel like I spent my career thinking too small. But Bo is the kind of man where that doesn't matter. He's been my friend since we were 16, and he is the rarest kind, the kind that time does nothing to. Cassidy had mentioned once when she was 16 that she had a dream about getting married at Elmwood Estate. It's a venue in the hills outside Knoxville, old stone building, formal gardens, the kind of place that photographs like a movie. She brought it up offhand one evening, laughing at herself a little, saying she'd looked at their website and the prices were basically science fiction. Then she changed the subject fast, the way she always changed the subject when she cared about something too much, like wanting something was a vulnerability she couldn't afford to show. I remembered that. I have always remembered everything about that girl, including the things she never knew I noticed. 3 years before the wedding, I called Bo. I wasn't asking for charity. I was talking to a friend. I told him what I was thinking, told him about the venue, about the savings I was working toward, about the weekend side jobs I was taking on to make it happen. Bo was quiet for a moment over the phone. Then he said, "How much do you need?" "I don't need anything from you," I said. "I just needed to tell somebody." He said, "All right, but if you come up short, you call me." Over the next 3 years, I took on weekend jobs I hadn't planned on. Skipped the fishing trip to Fontana Lake that Bo invited me on every fall and that I genuinely, sincerely wanted to take. Told Faye the extra money was going into savings, which wasn't untrue. It was just a different kind. I called Elmwood Estate in January 18 months before Cassidy and Shane got engaged. Found out the full pricing structure, started a separate account, put in whatever I could, whenever I could. When Cassidy got engaged to Shane in the spring, Shane Alderman, software developer, good man, the kind who opens car doors not because he's performing it, but because it's simply what he does. I called the venue and paid the final balance, $8,400, stamp paid in full. I told no one. Not Faye, not Bo. I put the receipt in the bottom drawer of my desk in an envelope, and I kept it there. I also had a cedar chest. I'd built it myself out of white oak about 10 years back when I'd gotten into woodworking as a way to keep my hands useful in the slow seasons. Nothing elaborate, a simple box with a fitted lid and a brass latch. I'd been putting things into it for years, not in any planned way. I didn't sit down and decide to build a record. I just kept things. A photograph from Cassidy's first art show when she was 8. She'd won a red ribbon for a painting of the Tennessee River, and her face in the photograph had the wide-open expression of someone who doesn't yet know that joy is something you're supposed to be careful with. A ticket stub from every school play, every spring exhibition, every small community gallery where she'd had a piece on the wall. I went to all of them. I sat in the back and I did not make it a thing. A drawing she'd made when she was 8 years old, a house with 4 people in front of it, stick figures with oversized heads. She'd given it to me one afternoon without any explanation and then gone back to watching cartoons. I'd folded it carefully and put it in my shirt pocket, and later at home I'd put it in the chest. She probably thought I'd thrown it away. That Tuesday evening, 3 days before the wedding, I was in the garage working on a faulty seal on the utility sink. Cassidy appeared in the doorway. She was wearing the expression I'd learned over 17 years to recognize, something rehearsed behind her eyes. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. I set down my wrench. She told me she wanted Lance to walk her down the aisle. She said it carefully, methodically, the way she'd been saying hard things carefully and methodically since she was a child who learned to feel things in private. She told me I'd been here, that meant something, that she didn't want me to feel bad about this. That Lance was her father, and this was her wedding day, and she thought it would be better, for everyone, if I didn't come. The garage went very still. I looked at my hands for a moment. I thought about a Saturday in November, when I walked into a studio on Market Street and stood against the wall in a work jacket and watched a 12-year-old paint a mountain with the kind of focus that makes you feel something you don't have a name for yet. "I understand," I said. That was all. She nodded, relieved in the way someone is relieved when a thing they were dreading is finally done, and she left. I looked up. Faye was standing at the garage door. She had heard every word. I could see it in the way she'd gone perfectly still, in the particular quality of her stillness, in the way she was looking at me with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite apology, and wasn't quite brave enough to be either one. Our eyes met. 1 second, 2. She turned and went back inside without making a sound. That was the moment I understood everything. Not Cassidy's words. I'd been preparing for something like Cassidy's words for a long time. Children shaped by fear do what fear teaches them, and that was not the wound. The wound was Faye's silence. 17 years of waking up before she did to start the coffee, of driving a little girl to art class in the gray of early morning, of sitting in the back rows of every small auditorium that mattered to her, of working weekend jobs in my 60s to pay for a wedding venue the girl didn't even know about yet. And Faye had stood in that doorway and chosen silence. I sat in the garage for a long time, long enough to understand that Cassidy's distance had never been entirely her own. It had been tended by hands that loved her, hands that were terrified, hands that couldn't see the damage they were doing until it was already long done. I went inside, I went to my study and opened the bottom drawer, and I took out the cedar chest and the envelope, and I sat at the kitchen table and I wrote 2 letters. The one for Cassidy I kept short. It said, "The venue is paid for, has been for 6 months. The receipt is in the envelope. The cedar chest is also yours. Everything in it has always been yours. The key to the latch is on top of the envelope. Open it when you're ready. Walk down that aisle with whoever you choose. I just need you to know that whoever stands beside you tomorrow, I was in the room long before they were. Drive safe, be happy, that's the whole thing. Gil." Faye's letter was longer. I will not give you every word of it. But it said, in part, "Faye, I've known for a long time that you were afraid I'd leave. I understood why. You'd been left before, and you weren't going to let Cassidy pay the price for trusting the wrong man again. I'm not writing this to accuse you. I'm writing it because I think you need to hear that I saw what you were doing. I saw it in the small things you said over the years. I saw it the night she was 13, and almost called me something she wasn't allowed to call me, and then stopped herself and went red, and you took her aside after. I saw it, and I stayed anyway, because leaving was never something I was going to do. That was the one thing you were wrong about, maybe the only thing. But it was the thing that cost Cassidy the most. I hope she finds her way to what she deserved all along. Gil." I set the cedar chest on the kitchen counter. I laid the envelope on top. I placed Faye's letter open beside it, face up. I put on my jacket. I turned off the kitchen light and left the hall light on, the way I always did, so the house wasn't dark when someone came home late. I did not slam the door. I pulled it closed behind me, quiet the way a man closes a door when he has made his peace with what's on the other side of it. I drove out to a spot I know off Rutledge Pike, About 15 minutes from the house, where the road drops down toward the Holston River, and there's a gravel pullout where you can cut the engine and hear nothing but water and tree frogs and the occasional truck going by up on the ridge. I used to go there in my 30s when the world got too loud. It still works the same way. I cut the engine. I sat in the dark with the windows down. I was not running. I just needed somewhere to put my hands on the steering wheel and not have to be anybody for a little while. If you've been listening this long, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, and it costs you nothing. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. I'll be right back with you. Cassidy came home at 10:30. She'd been at her mother's friend's house for a bridal dinner. She walked in through the side door the way she always did, went to the kitchen for a glass of water the way she always did, and she saw the cedar chest on the counter. She picked up the envelope first, read the letter, then she found the receipt. She had to read it twice before she believed what it said. $8,400. Paid in full. Elmwood Estate. A date 6 months back. She set the paper down very carefully. She picked up the small brass key on top of the envelope. She opened the cedar chest. 17 years of photographs looked up at her. Not the posed ones. There were none of those. These were the candid ones. Cassidy at 8, red ribbon in hand, mountain painting on the wall behind her, face split open with surprise and joy. Cassidy at 12 in the second row of a school play, barely visible in the crowd, but the photograph taken from exactly the right angle. The angle of someone who had positioned themselves to see her specifically. Cassidy at 15 at her first real gallery showing, standing in front of a piece she'd made, not yet knowing anyone was watching. Ticket stubs, programs, a ribbon, and underneath everything else, a drawing of a house with 4 people in front of it, stick figures with big heads, drawn in crayon on a piece of notebook paper that had been folded once and kept perfectly flat. She picked up the drawing, looked at it for a long time. She remembered making it. She was 8 years old and she'd drawn it without thinking too much, just her family as she understood it at the time, and she'd given it to Gil one afternoon on some impulse she couldn't explain anymore. She'd assumed he'd recycled it. He'd kept it in a cedar chest he built with his own hands. Faye read her letter at the kitchen table. Alone, she read it 4 times, she cried, which Faye almost never does, because Faye has had a lot of practice not crying. By the time Cassidy found her there, she had stopped but hadn't moved. Cassidy sat down across from her and asked the question quietly, the way Cassidy does everything that costs her something. Did he know? Did Gil know what you were doing all those years? The things you'd say about not getting too settled, about things changing? Did he know? Faye opened her mouth, closed it. Cassidy is going to be a formidable woman in whatever she decides to do with her life. She already is. She knows how to wait someone out. Faye told her, not all of it at once. Some of it came out in pieces over the months that followed. But she told her enough about Lance leaving, about Wesley before Lance, about building a careful distance around Cassidy's heart because she could not survive watching her daughter love a man who might do what those men had done. Cassidy was quiet for a long time. He paid for the wedding venue, she said finally. 6 months ago, he never said one word about it. Faye had no answer for that. Some things answer themselves. Cassidy picked up her phone. I was still out at the Holston River pullout, engine off, watching the water move in the dark when my phone lit up on the passenger seat. Cassidy's name on the screen. I sat with it for 2 full rings, then I picked up. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I opened the chest, she said. I figured you would. Silence. Then you kept the drawing, the house with the 4 people. You gave it to me. She was quiet again. When she spoke next, her voice had the particular texture of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been handed permission to set it down. I want you at my wedding, she said. I want you there, Gil. I let the silence breathe for just a second. I'll be there, I said. I already got a haircut. She laughed at that, and I want to tell you about that laugh because it matters. It wasn't polished, and composure tried to get back in quickly, because that's who Cassidy is, and probably always will be. But underneath that, underneath all the careful self-possession she'd spent a lifetime building, was the laugh of someone who has just been told they're allowed to feel the thing they've been feeling all along. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, she sounded completely free. We met 2 days later at a diner on Gay Street downtown. She was there before me, which I should have expected. Cassidy is always early. She stood up when I walked in and she didn't reach for a handshake, which is what she would have done 5 years ago. She hugged me. Both arms, real pressure, hands on my back, like she was making sure I was actually solid and standing there and not going anywhere. We sat down, we ordered, we talked for close to 3 hours. I'm not going to give you every word of it. Some things belong to the table they happened at. But somewhere around the second cup of coffee, Cassidy looked at me and said, "Why didn't you ever say anything about what you knew, about what she was doing all those years?" I thought about it for a moment. "Because you didn't need me to be right," I said. "You needed me to be there." She looked at her cup, nodded slowly, then quietly, like it cost her something to say it out loud. "You were there." I was. On the day of the wedding, Cassidy walked down the aisle with Lance on her left and me on her right. She'd made that decision herself, without anyone suggesting it, without asking permission. Lance looked surprised and then gracious about it, which I will give him credit for. I stood at the end of that aisle in a borrowed suit, Beau's suit, a size close enough, and I did not try to be her father. I just stood there and witnessed the thing I had been showing up for on Saturday mornings for 17 years to eventually see. She was radiant. Shane looked like a man who understood exactly how fortunate he was. The gardens at Elmwood Estate were everything a 16-year-old once looked at on a website and called science fiction, and then changed the subject fast, because wanting something too much had always felt like a risk she wasn't supposed to take. The cedar chest sits on a bookshelf in Cassidy and Shane's living room now. She told me she put it there the first week they moved in. Shane asked about it and she told him the whole story, which took a while. Cassidy and I have lunch once a month. She picks the place most of the time and picks up the check more often than not, which she calls working through the backlog. I let her. The places she picks have genuinely excellent food, and she seems to enjoy being the one who gets to do something for a change. A couple of months ago, she mentioned she'd taken the drawing out of the chest and had it framed. "You drew it when you were 8, I said. "I know, I want it on the wall." She paused. "I still can't believe you kept it." "I kept everything," I said. "That's what showing up looks like." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me over a coffee cup with those dark eyes that are her mother's and somehow also entirely her own. "I know that now," she said. "I know. I drive home from those lunches on the same roads I've been driving for 30 years, past the ridge line, past the river, past the gravel turnoff, where I used to sit and think when the house felt too small for whatever I was carrying. These days I don't stop there as often. I think about a 7-year-old girl who shook my hand like a little businesswoman and went straight back to her room. I think about a November morning in a studio on Market Street, standing against the wall in my work jacket, watching her paint a mountain with everything she had. And I think I'm glad I stayed. I never needed her to call me Dad. I want you to know that before you go. I never needed the title, never asked for the credit, never once put my hand out for something in return. All I ever needed was to know that when it was over, she'd remember that somebody had been there, that it had meant something to somebody. It went that way, eventually, and eventually turned out to be enough. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe to Dad's Harsh Revenge for more stories like this one. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. I'll see you on the next one.